The mid-1950s, aviation was beginning to move beyond the propeller age. Piston airliners droned across routes at the speed of a fast car, and the jet age was still in its infancy, until Boeing made a bet that nearly broke the company. They poured almost every single dollar of post-war profit into a single prototype, the 367-80, and gambled that the future of flight was jet-powered. But that audacious bet triggered a cascade of engineering decisions that made this aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. Why did the 707's engines look so long and thin compared with the turbofans of today? Why did it spit black smoke into the sky on every takeoff? And why did Boeing have to literally widen the whole aircraft because of a flight with Douglas? You're about to discover extraordinary quirks of the jet that built the modern world, from engines that drank water to make more power, to a cabin shape born from a commercial knife fight, from a noise footprint that got it banned, to a cruising speed that still embarrasses the airliners you fly today. The aircraft that didn't just join the jet age, it created it. Trust us, the secret bonus quirk at the very end is one almost nobody outside the cockpit ever knew about. Quirk 1. Why the 707's engines look so long and thin. Stand next to a 707, especially the original, and the engines look almost wrong to modern eyes. They're long, slim, pencil-thin, compared with the enormous barrel-shaped turbofans hanging under a 787 or A350 today. Where a modern engine looks like it could swallow a car whole, the 707's power plants look more like 4 polished torpedoes bolted under the wing. Why did Boeing's flagship jet wear such skinny engines? The answer reveals everything about where the 707 sat in history. Those were early turbojets. The original aircraft used Pratt & Whitney JT3C engines, which were essentially civilian versions of the military J57 that powered fighters and bombers of the era. These were pure turbojets, with very low bypass ratios. Almost all of the air went straight through the engine's core to be burned, rather than being shoved around the outside by a big fan the way a modern turbofan does. No giant fan meant no giant cowling, so the whole engine stayed long, narrow, and lean. The strategic logic was simple. In the 1950s, this was the cutting edge. There was no high bypass technology yet. Boeing took proven military-derived engines and hung 4 of them under a swept wing, and that combination alone was revolutionary. But physics doesn't negotiate. Those slim turbojets were thirsty, loud, and hungry for runway. They produced their thrust by violently accelerating a relatively small mass of air to very high speed, which is exactly the recipe for noise and fuel burn. To put it into perspective, a modern engine on a single-aisle jet today produces more than double the thrust of one of those early turbojets, while burning a fraction of the fuel and making a fraction of the noise. Then the world changed. The turbofan arrived, bypass ratios climbed, and engines got fatter, quieter, and dramatically more efficient. The 707's skinny torpedoes suddenly looked like relics. The very thing that made the 707 cutting edge in the 1950s made it obsolete 20 years later. Quirk 2. The fuselage was widened because of a fight with Douglas. Look at the 707 and you see a clean, confident shape. What you don't see is that this shape was forged in a commercial knife fight. The original Boeing -80 demonstrator, the prototype that started it all, was actually narrower than the 707 that eventually entered service. So, why did Boeing widen it? Because Douglas was breathing down their neck. The rival DC-8 was being designed with a wider cabin, and airlines wanted the extra width. 6 abreast seating, more comfort, more competitive economics. Boeing realized that if they stuck with their slim prototype fuselage, they'd lose orders to Douglas before the 707 had even properly launched. So, Boeing widened the production aircraft. The famous 707 cross-section we know, and the family resemblance that carried all the way through to later Boeing narrowbodies, was partly the result of a sales battle, not pure engineering. This might seem like a small change, but it had profound implications. Widening a fuselage isn't a tweak, it ripples through the entire structure. Frames, skin panels, floor beams, pressurization calculations, weight and balance, all of it had to be reworked to accommodate the wider tube. But here's the brilliant part. That commercially driven decision shaped the next half-century of Boeing. The widened 707 cabin set a template. Its descendants and design language echoed through the 727 and the 737, a choice made to beat Douglas in the late 1950s, quietly influenced how millions of passengers would sit, board, and fly for generations. The 707's defining shape was, in part, a weapon in a war for orders. Quirk 3. A wing swept straight out of a bomber. Here's something most passengers never connect when they look out at a 707 wing. That dramatic, sharply swept back wing didn't come from the airline world at all. It came from Boeing's bombers. The 707's highly swept wing was a direct inheritance from Boeing's experience building the B-47 and the B-52. The swept wing jet bombers that taught Boeing how to make a big jet go fast. It looks elegant. The reason behind it is pure physics. Sweeping the wing back delays the onset of the troublesome airflow effects that build up as an aircraft approaches the speed of sound. A swept wing lets the aircraft cruise much faster before those effects start to bite. For a jet designed to outrun every propeller airliner on Earth, that speed was the entire point. But that bomber DNA came with a price at the other end of the speed range. A highly swept wing is wonderful when you're charging along at cruise, but it's far less friendly at low speed. Compared with the gentle, forgiving propeller airlines that pilots were used to, the 707 was demanding when slow, on approach, in the landing flare, in the margins where a wing wants to stop flying. Pilots transitioning from pistons to the 707 had to relearn their instincts. The aircraft was faster, heavier, and far less tolerant of sloppy speed control near the ground. The swept wing was the key that unlocked the jet age. It was also a reminder that the technology came from the world of bombers, and it didn't forgive amateurs. Quirk 4. The cockpit needed a fourth crew member. Step into a 707 cockpit and you'll notice something that's vanished from almost every airliner flying today. A third, and on some early operations, even a fourth crew member. The classic 707 flight deck carried a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. Earlier in the jet age, long overwater flights also carried a navigator, before modern navigation made the role obsolete. So, why so many people just to fly one aircraft? Because the 707 was a deeply hands-on machine. The flight engineer sat sideways at a wall of dials, gauges, and levers, personally managing the systems that a modern jet handles automatically: fuel balancing between tanks, electrical generation, hydraulics, cabin pressurization, and the careful nursing of those 4 thirsty engines. On a modern 2-pilot jet, computers quietly manage all of this. On the 707, a human being did it by hand, watching needles and making adjustments throughout the flight. This wasn't inefficiency for its own sake, it reflected the technology of the time. The systems simply weren't automated yet, setting engine power precisely, keeping the electrics balanced, managing the pressurization schedule. These all demanded constant human attention. The flight engineer wasn't a luxury, he was load-bearing. It also changed the culture of the cockpit. 3 sets of eyes, 3 sets of hands, a genuine team managing a complex machine together. As automation matured, the flight engineer's role was steadily absorbed by computers and the 2 remaining pilots. The 707 belonged to an age when flying a jet was a craft performed by a crew, not a system supervised by 2. Quirk 5. It was punishingly loud. We have to talk about the noise. If you've only ever flown on modern jets, you genuinely cannot imagine how loud the early 707 was. This was one of the defining sounds of the first jet age. A piercing, screaming, high-pitched roar that announced the aircraft long before you could read the titles on its tail. Why was it so brutally loud? It comes straight back to those early turbojets. A pure turbojet made its thrust by blasting a jet of air out the back at very high velocity, and the violent mixing of that high-speed exhaust with the still air around it is what generates that ear-splitting, tearing scream. Modern turbofans wrap a huge slug of slower-moving air around the core, which cushions the exhaust and dramatically cuts the noise. The 707 had none of that. It was raw, naked jet exhaust. For people living near airports, the arrival of the 707 was a genuine shock to daily life. The sound was unlike anything aviation had produced before. Hush kits were fitted to dampen the worst of it, and many aircraft were re-engined with quieter turbofans. But it was never enough. As noise regulations tightened around the world, the early 707's screaming turbojets simply couldn't comply. That noise footprint became one of the major reasons the type was pushed out of passenger service. The sound that thrilled a generation of aviation fans ultimately helped legislate the 707 out of the sky. Quirk 6. It left trails of black smoke. Watch old footage of a 707 taking off and you'll spot something that would trigger an emergency call today. Thick, dark trails of black smoke streaming from the engines. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't an engine on the edge of failure. This was just how early jets ran. Why all the smoke? Early jet engines simply weren't clean burning by any modern standard. The combustion inside those first-generation engines was inefficient and produced a lot of unburned carbon, which streamed out of the exhaust as visible black soot, most dramatically at high power settings during takeoff and the initial climb. So, every departure came with a signature smudge across the sky. 4 engines, 4 sooty trails, merging into a dark smear behind the climbing jet. It became part of the very image of the first jet age. If you look at period photographs and film of 707s, DC-8s, and early 727s, that black smoke is almost always there, an unmistakable fingerprint of the era. It was also, frankly, a sign of how much fuel was being burned imperfectly. Combustion technology has come an extraordinarily long way since then. Modern engines burn so cleanly and completely that visible smoke from a healthy airliner is essentially a thing of the past. That black smoke trail is one of the purest visual signatures of just how far jet technology has traveled. The 707 didn't whisper across the sky, it announced itself in sound and in soot. Quirk 7. Water-powered takeoffs. Here's a quirk that sounds almost made up, but it was pure 1950s brute force engineering. Some early 707s were, in a sense, partly powered by water on takeoff. Wait, water in a jet engine? Yes, early 707s used water injection, sometimes a water-methanol mix, sprayed into the engines during takeoff to squeeze out extra thrust when the aircraft needed it most. The physics is wonderfully old school. On a hot day, air is thin and engines struggle to make full power, exactly when a heavy jet most needs it. By injecting water into the engine, you increase the mass of fluid flowing through it and cool things down, which let those early turbojets produce noticeably more thrust for the critical couple of minutes of the takeoff roll. On the original engines, that injection could lift takeoff thrust. But it came at a cost. The aircraft had to carry tanks of water, plumbing, and the associated weight and complexity, all for a system used only for a few minutes per flight. Crews had to manage it, ground staff had to refill it, and it gave operations a distinctly heavy industrial, brute force character, the very opposite of the clean, push-button efficiency of a modern jet. That dramatic takeoff often came with even more smoke and an extra layer of theater as the water-boosted engines clawed for altitude. Water injection eventually disappeared as more powerful, more efficient turbofans made the trick unnecessary. But for a while, the jet that defined the future was being helped into the air by something as simple and ancient as water. Quirk 8. The 707 forced airports to reinvent themselves. Here's a quirk that isn't about the aircraft at all, it's about everything around it. The 707 didn't just need an airport, it forced airports to grow up. When the 707 arrived, it was simply too much aircraft for the infrastructure of the propeller age. Why did one aircraft demand so much change? Because nothing about it fit in the existing world. It was heavier, so it needed stronger runways and taxiways that wouldn't crack under its weight. It was faster on approach and used more runway, so runways had to be lengthened. It carried far more passengers at once, so terminals, gates, and baggage systems had to scale up to handle the surge of people pouring off a single jet. Then there were the entirely new needs. Jet engines wanted different fuel and different ground equipment. The whole choreography of turning an aircraft around, fueling, servicing, boarding had to be rethought for a machine operating at a completely different scale. Jet bridges, bigger terminals, longer and stronger runways, new ground support. The 707 era pushed all of it forward. So, one of the great quirks of the 707 is that it was never just an aircraft. It was an infrastructure disruptor. The shape of the modern airport, the long runways, the sprawling terminals, the jet bridges reaching out to the aircraft door was substantially shaped by the demands of early jets like the 707. We don't just fly differently because of the 707, we built the whole world of air travel around it. Quirk 9. Revolutionary, but not exactly roomy. It's tempting to imagine the 707 as a palace of early jet age glamour. The reality in the cabin was a little more modest. Yes, the 707 ended up with 6 abreast seating, 3 on each side of the aisle, which was genuinely competitive for its day. But by the standards of the wide bodies that followed, it was a narrow tube. So, how spacious was it really? The 707's fuselage was relatively slim. It predated the wide-body era entirely. There was a single aisle, 6 seats across, and a cabin that felt cozy rather than cavernous compared with the 747's, DC-10s, and twin-aisle jets that arrived later. It was revolutionary in speed and reach, less so in sheer interior volume. That said, context matters enormously. For passengers stepping aboard from the propeller era, the 707 still felt like the future. Smoother, higher, faster, and above the worst of the weather. The glamour was real, even if the cabin itself wasn't enormous. The mismatch is really one of expectations across time. Judged against its piston-engined predecessors, the 707 was a triumph of comfort and speed. Judged against the spacious widebodies that helped make it possible, it looks tight. That's the fate of a true pioneer. The 707 changed what passengers expected from air travel so completely that its own cabin was eventually outgrown by the very revolution it started. Revolutionary doesn't always mean roomy. Quirk 10. It was fast, sometimes faster than the jet you flew on last week. Let's finish the main list with the quirk that genuinely surprises people. The 707 was fast. In fact, in pure cruising speed, it could embarrass a lot of the modern jets flying today. The 707 typically cruised in the region of Mach 0.8, and the early jet age in general loved to push the speed. How can a 1950s design be quicker than a brand new airliner? Because the priorities completely flipped. In the first jet age, speed was the product. Airlines sold the romance of crossing oceans in hours instead of days, and the 707 was built to deliver exactly that. Modern jets deliberately cruise a little slower. The reason is fuel economy. With today's big high bypass engines, pushing faster burns dramatically more fuel per passenger mile. So, airlines trade a slither of speed for a big saving in cost and emissions. The 707 came from a world that valued speed and prestige over fuel burn. It helped create the very expectation that jets were glamorous and fast, the gleaming symbol of a faster future, even though that glamour came wrapped in noise, soot, and eye-watering fuel bills. There's a real irony there. The aircraft that taught the world to expect speed was eventually overtaken not by faster jets, but by smarter, more economical ones that chose to slow down on purpose. The 707 didn't just fly fast, it made fast feel like the whole point of flying. Quirk 11. Secret bonus. The 707 that quietly built every Boeing jet after it. Here's the secret almost nobody outside the industry ever thinks about. The 707 didn't just spawn passenger jets. Its closest relative quietly became one of the most important military aircraft of the century, and the family went on to underpin Boeing for decades. The 707 grew out of that single gamble, the 367-80 prototype. But from that same lineage came the KC-135, the air-to-air refueling tanker that has kept entire air forces flying for generation after generation. And the bloodline doesn't stop there. The same basic airframe and design heritage spawned a sprawling family of special-purpose military aircraft, airborne command posts, electronic reconnaissance jets, and the distinctive radar-domed airborne early warning aircraft you've seen with a giant rotating disc on the back. Many of those descendants are still flying today, decades after the last passenger 707 left scheduled service. So, while you're struggling to find a 707 carrying holidaymakers anywhere now, its DNA is still aloft, refueling fighters, watching skies, and carrying command crews around the world. And here's the part that ties it all together. That original company betting gamble didn't just produce one aircraft. It produced a template, a manufacturing base, and an engineering confidence that carried Boeing through the 727, the 737, and beyond. The skinny-engined, smoke-trailing, water-boosted screamer from the 1950s quietly seeded an entire dynasty. The 707 didn't just join the jet age, it built the company and much of the sky that came after it. So, what was the Boeing 707? A crude relic of a noisier, dirtier age? Or the single aircraft that changed everything? Perhaps that's the wrong question. Those slim, screaming turbojets that drank water and trailed smoke also dragged humanity into the jet age and shrank the planet forever. The bomber-bred swept wing that punished careless pilots also let ordinary travelers cross oceans in hours. The fourth crew member, who managed it all by hand, belonged to an era when flying a jet was a genuine craft. The widened fuselage born from a fight with Douglas shaped the look of Boeing jets for half a century. Each quirk was a direct answer to a real engineering or commercial problem of its time. The 707 was eventually outpaced, outquieted, and out-economized by its own descendants. But influence isn't measured in noise complaints or fuel bills. Its DNA still flies today, decades after it carried its last fare-paying passenger. Its boldness, its sheer first-mover audacity, inspired a generation who understood that someone has to go first, and that going first is rarely quiet, clean, or cheap. Which quirk of the 707 surprised you most? Did you ever fly on one or hear one scream overhead? Share your stories and thoughts below, and subscribe for more investigations into the aircraft that broke the rules and built the future. Hey, before you go, the YouTube algorithm thinks you're going to like this video next, so why not check it out?